Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our panel discussion today on geopolitical risk and restructuring. We're delighted to have three experts come and talk to us today on this exciting topic. Just to introduce them briefly, Emanuela Carbonara, some of you will know, is a professor of economic policy at the University of Bologna, but very importantly, an adjunct professor of international economics here at SAIS for many years. And she has been a visiting professor at many universities throughout the world, and is the founding member of the Italian Society for Law and Economics. And so she does a lot of work in law and economics as well. She has a DPhil from Oxford University and a PhD from Bocconi University. So immediately to my right here, we've got Richard Pomfret, who is obviously no stranger to SAIS. He's one of the few individuals who has taught both, he started out here, teaching for SAIS anyway, in the 80s at the Bologna campus. For many years, he taught at the DC campus, and he's also taught at our Nanjing campus. He's a senior adjunct professor here at SAIS Europe. He's with us in residence in the spring, so you'll get to see a lot of him. He has been at the University of Adelaide since 1992, and besides SAIS, he's been at the Kiel Institute in Germany, as well as Concordia University in Montreal, and has his PhD from Simon Fraser University. So he's got a very extensive international background and works on a variety of international economic issues. He recently published a book, for example, on European integration as a Jean Monnet scholar, I believe, but also is very well known in the Asia Pacific and in Central Asia. And when I took a course from him, it was on the Mediterranean. So he's done a lot of different things. And last, and of course not least, we have Peter Petri, who's the Carl Shapiro Professor of International Finance at Brandeis University in the International Business School. And I might mention that Peter actually is the founder of the International Business School a while ago, and was its founding dean for many years. He's a non-resident senior fellow at Brookings Institution in Washington, as well as a visiting fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. He's had visiting scholar and visiting professor positions also all over the world at international organizations like the OECD, ADB, etc., and has been an adjunct professor at extremely important universities like Johns Hopkins, SAIS Europe in the past. Peter is a very well-known expert on East Asian cooperation, integration, and both Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia. And it's great to have him back, as well as Richard and to see Emanuela. So what we thought we'd do is we would have three presentations, or at least two presentations and some discussion comments. And starting off with Peter, and since he's presenting a paper that he and I have been working on, we decided I would sort of kick it off and then hand it off to him. Then Richard will give his talk, and followed by comments from Emanuela. So perhaps Peter and I will take 20 minutes, Richard 20 minutes, and 10 minutes for you. Is that okay, Emanuela? Okay. All right, so why don't we start off? Just to mention this, the PowerPoint, come si fa? Just 1 second. Dobbiamo andare all'inizio. Ok, perfetto. Come posso? Ok. Good. Thanks. Okay, well, the name of the study is Regional Cooperation, Geopolitical Threats. and the new normal in the Indo-Pacific region. And and the paper asks essentially three central questions. By the way, this is all from an economics point of view. We're not looking at the political economy or the international relations aspects of it so much. But the first question is, how will recent shocks change the world economy? The second question is, what happens if threats to deglobalization materialize? And finally, would economic cooperation help? So the first question really looks at something that's a bit exogenous, if you will, to policymakers, at least in the Asia Pacific, and the others tend to be more endogenous in a function of policy. So, ecco. So just very briefly, obviously shocks in the world economy would include the Russian war in the Ukraine, and the resulting sanctions from that has created a great deal of risk in the international marketplace, and it's not, we've got the NATO plus countries that applied sanctions on Russia. Russia, of course, on trade with those countries as well, and these have been fairly severe sanctions, and sanctions that are expected to continue. I mean, perhaps this is for a different day, but sort of looking at the scenario in which they would be removed is very difficult. And as Peter will review, we use a computable general equilibrium model, so that will go through 2035. And so it's kind of hard to see how that changes over time. So we've got the Russian war, we've got the rapid rise in the price of natural resources, which is a shorter term phenomenon, but is in some ways more severe to the global economy. So that's going to be over the next few years before it would sort of converge towards a longer term equilibrium, but obviously it's had a major effect. And third, of course, is the major problem of stagflation. So the rise in inflation and the responses to it. And even though inflation, for example, in Asia has not spiked like it has in the United States, and I mean, the same would be true with Europe, it's not as bad as in the United States. The fact that the U.S. is such a central economy in the global marketplace, it's having an effect on everyone, right? So you've got this rise in interest rates, it's bringing up interest rates all around, and the dollar has become extremely strong, as the students will know, at least the American students. I know it's fairly favorable when your tuition payments come due. Right, so those are three recent shocks. The other set of simulations, the other set of issues we look at is what if we have deglobalization policies that materialize, such as reshoring. We hear a lot about reshoring, or if you will, a retreat from trade by large economies. This is said, okay, we need this for our strategic interests, we need this to compete with China, or whatever it is. But in a way, to an economist, it almost looks like just old-fashioned protectionism with a reason to do it. Right. So what we're seeing are these announcements. OK, what do we do if we have active reshoring policy by major economies? What are the economic effects of that? And, I don't know any literature really that looks at that very much. And so we've got some simulations for that. Another is nearshoring, something that, for example, Janet Yellen mentions as U.S. Secretary of the Treasury on focusing on supply chains. And so maybe what you do is you focus on sourcing from the region, right? So you bring it towards the region, right? So that would be nearshoring, or perhaps friendshoring, where you have it. And this is something Secretary Yellen would also talk about, of having deeper sort of trade relations with our friends, right? And in that situation, so we have close friends, we have others that are neutral, and then we have the others, right, that are problems. So these things are very important, and it's related to policy, but is going to be very important moving forward, or at least that's our hypothesis. And then finally, the question is whether or not going in the opposite direction, if further openness would help through economic cooperation. And in these simulations, we're seeing a lot more interest in the Indo-Pacific, including the Biden administration has its Indo-Pacific economic framework. Not clear exactly what that means yet, but that's a proposal on the table. So the U.S. would like to re-engage with the region after the Trump administration, but we have a lot else that's going on without the United States. There's the RCEP agreement, which went into effect in January of this year, which includes 15 countries in the East Asian region. We've got the CPTPP, which is the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was the old TPP before the U.S. exited from it. So the CPTPP has 11 countries in it, but it is actively considering enlargement. So right now, for example, the UK's application to join the CPTPP is being evaluated. The same with South Korea. So what are those effects? And what are the effects if, further on down the line, we have other countries that have been interested in joining? What happens if they join? So in that simulation, so the first simulation, that first enlargement we do beginning in 2024, and then there's the simulation include 3 additional ASEAN countries, Indonesia, Philippines, and Thailand, who haven't formally applied yet, but are interested in applying. So what are the economic effects of that? And then finally, we have a general sort of globalization benchmark that would harken back to old thinking, if you will, in terms of Asia-Pacific cooperation, but something that would be more inclusive generally. So in this simulation, in addition to that CPTPP second enlargement, we include the United States coming back, the EU joining, which the probability of which increases as the UK joins, as well as China, which has formally applied to the CPTPP, and Taiwan. So that's an enlargement of the CPTPP, and then India joining RCEP. Some of you that have been following this, you'll know that India was an original negotiator of RCEP, but pulled out in November of 2019 before it went forward, but could rejoin negotiations whenever it likes. So in general, these are the questions that we're going to be addressing. And so let me hand it over to Peter, who will go through the model.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be back. I have been here before, and it was especially nice to be introduced by Mike. Mike and I have been working together for more years than I think either of us cares to remember. And this is a product of that collaboration, which has looked very specifically at the East Asian economies, but also their relationships with the United States, Europe, and other parts of the world. So it's a very familiar ground that I am on, both here in Bologna and working with Mike and presenting this paper with him. What I'd like to do is just give you a quick sense of the methodology we use, because it may be, here it is, and I think you can all see it. It's an unusual methodology. I don't know how many people here are familiar with it. I would assume many are not. I would also hope that some of you will become familiar with it, and maybe in the course of your studies will eventually use a model something like this. It's very good for looking at the world as a whole. You look at countries, usually the world is divided up into regions. For looking at industries, the economy is divided up into specific subsectors, and looking at evolution of all of these things over time. In our model, we have 30 countries or regions. Some of them are country groups. We have 25 sectors. So there is natural resources, there is oil, there is agriculture, and then there are various manufacturing sectors, as well as services. And then we look at the period from 2021 to 2035. Some of the internal structure of the model involves a lot of data, but there are now associations and networks of economists that provide the data, that have collected the data individually and put it together. So it's not so difficult to get access to the data, even though they're huge. And they include data, for example, on trade patterns, on the structure of inputs into an industry, on what people in different parts of the world consume. So it's sort of consumption coefficients, production coefficients, trade coefficients of various sorts. It also includes a lot of policy parameters, taxes, tariffs, and so on. And these are the things that you then change from one scenario to another to get a sense of what the effects of a certain policy intervention might be. And then finally, we solve for the usual kinds of macroeconomic variables like GDP, consumption levels, but also for detailed data. So we can look at what industries will be affected how in what kinds of, in a particular type of trade scenario. So this is a really kind of powerful tool. A student actually a couple of days ago asked me, I'd like to do this paper I have due in 2 weeks on what the effect of environmental regulations might be in one part of the world on the world economy with this methodology. And I said, great, that's perfect application. How much of this work have you done? And she said, well, I haven't yet, but I know it's a powerful tool and I'd like to use it. Not in 2 weeks, no way. It takes a lot of time to learn it. It takes a lot of time to put the data together to get the computer coding. But once you're there, it's very powerful for a wide range of questions, from the kind of global economics questions to environmental questions to tax policy questions. So a lot of different kinds of questions you can answer with this model, and it is widely used. So the data encoded for this model come from the World Trade Organization's model, which is it has a lot of resources behind it, as well as from some work that Mike and I have done over the years and developed our own model. We gave up on that model, by the way, and have switched to this new one precisely because so much work is involved in refreshing the data. So having the World Trade Organization collect it for us for free, by the way, is very nice. As the analysis, what do? Well, you first run the model and create a baseline. So you know all the values of the variables from 2021 to 2035. Then you change the assumptions, solve the model again. You have a new solution and compare that to the baseline. So how has GDP in the ASEAN countries changed as a result of, say, the United States turning to reshoring? That is, erecting protectionist barriers in the United States. How has that affected a certain industry in a far distant part of the world? Model can answer all of those questions. So that's the basic methodology. I wanted to give you a bit of a sense for it. I know I'm doing this at very broad brush, but it is a very useful tool. Now, here are the scenarios themselves. So we tried ultimately 9, actually it's many more than that, but 9 that are useful scenarios for this presentation. And these are the ones that Mike already mentioned as the kind of key questions we're asking. We're asking about the new normal scenario, which consists of 3 different parts. It's Russia being isolated by much of the rest of the world through sanctions, Russia itself applying sanctions, for example, cutting off fuel exports to Europe, resource prices rising. So it's true that what's happening now is not going to be kind of continuing for the next 15 years, the very sharp rises in resource prices. But it's also very unlikely that they'll come back to levels that they have been at up till about 2021. And 2020 was an extraordinary low level of resource prices in the world, but that followed about a decade of declining resource prices. So what we see now is a kind of going back closer to the very, very old normal, but it's also likely to be much more expensive energy, fuels, and raw materials for the world. It will also drag with it agricultural prices because agriculture depends to a large extent on energy. Then come geopolitical threats, and we'll look at three particular ones that have gotten a lot of attention recently. Reshoring, that is bringing all production back home by the big countries. Little countries can't do that. They're sort of not an option for them. But for big countries, for Europe, for the United States, for China, maybe for Japan, to some extent it is. And then finally, friendshoring. This is especially a European term now. Where the idea is you basically trade with your friends. You don't trade with those bad guys like Russia or China, or even with neutral countries. You might be a little worried about them because they might transfer technology to other big powers. And so you erect regulations, barriers that make it more likely that you will be trading with countries that are politically in the same group. And we've defined these groups, by the way. One of them is NATO plus, which is NATO, but also some other countries like Australia and South Korea, which are friendly to it and likely to be joining in related initiative. Now, trade cooperation is the last and I think in many ways the most interesting. There are very good possibilities for trade cooperation. We don't think much about them in the United States or in Europe these days. Europe is not as bad as the US, but the US has sort of given up on the idea that it needs to think about trade cooperation with other countries as a priority for the time being. But these are real possibilities, and in East Asia, they are alive. So East Asia is concluding new agreement. There is an Australian EU negotiation underway, which is likely to work fairly soon. We may hear about that from Richard. So there is trade cooperation on the table in East Asia, and we'll look at what effect those initiatives may have in offsetting both the costs of the new normal, the geopolitical threats, and there is this one tool, not many tools, but one tool that we can use, and that is economic cooperation to offset those. By the way, I should mention that Mike calls this paper as the good, bad, and the ugly. Now, if you know about American movie history, Good, Bad, and the Ugly was a very famous Western in American movies. And this is really sort of, let you decide which is the bad and which is the ugly. The new normal and the geopolitical threats are both candidates for bad or ugly. The good is obviously trade cooperation. Okay, so very quickly going through the results. This is what the new normal scenario does. So you include Russian sanctions and you include higher resource prices, and this is what you get. The groups, we analyzed this for 4 groups. ASEAN, we're interested in the smaller Asian economies in Southeast Asia. The CPTPP is a group of countries, also mostly in Asia, but it includes Canada and Mexico from the Americas, not the United States. The United States kind of gave up on it. RCEP, which is a big East Asian group, includes China. The NATO plus, which you can think of who they are. They're obviously Europe, North America, and other allies. And then we include Russia on this page because Russia is the one that really gets hurt economically in the scenario as they unfold. These are percentage changes in income. Big percentage changes are for the big negative percentage changes are for Russia and for RCEP, the big Southeast Asian economies. For Russia, it's about Russian sanctions. For RCEP, it's about rising resource prices. These are manufacturing economies. They are big importers of natural resources. They depend on the world essentially to fuel their economies. China, obviously very important among them, but so is Japan, so is South Korea. So that's where you see the changes, but they're negative all across the map, with the exception of some individual resource rich countries. So what are the takeaways from the new normal scenario? Let me just skip to this. The world growth slows pretty substantially by about let's say about 20% in the next 5 years, but also slightly even after that. Most severely affected Russia, also seriously affected China, Japan, and East Asia. Unaffected, maybe the United States. It's a very balanced economy, a lot of resources as well as manufacturing, and positively affected very few. Middle East, obviously. Australia, interestingly, it's very dependent on exports of natural resources. So that's what the new normal looked like. Now let's look at what happens when you deglobalize, when you implement one of these policies of either bringing production back home or to import only from countries nearby or to import only from friends. So these are all ways of breaking apart what used to be pretty well interconnected and to some extent still are interconnected markets. Again, big negative results all across the map. You see ASEAN countries particularly negatively affected. Why? Because they're small economies, they can't reshore. They depend on trade with others, particularly in Asia with Japan and China, but also with Europe and the United States. The NATO countries don't get hurt as much, mainly because they're big. They're not as open to the rest of the world as many others are. Europe, yes, Europe is open as vis-a-vis Italy and Germany, but it's not open so much vis-a-vis China or South America, for example. So the big takeaways there are negatives. This is the export results of the globalization scenario. This looks very similar to the previous one, which I showed for GDP. It's just bigger because the export effects are even bigger than the income effects. But the takeaways are that deglobalization has large negative effects virtually on everyone, but especially on smaller economies like those in ASEAN. Among the different threat scenarios, the least bad is friendshoring. Now you might say, well, shouldn't friendshoring be bad? The idea that you only trade with friends, politically close countries. And the answer is it's bad. You shouldn't be discriminating. But it turns out not to have very large effect because we already do that a lot. So that those relationships in trade are already very strong. So the idea that you will focus more closely on them does not have as much damaging effect on the world economy as, for example, does the idea that you only trade with countries next to you. Because a lot of our trade, in fact, is with countries very far away. Finally, here comes economic cooperation, and you know this is the good. All the bars now point up instead of down. And especially point up for this kind of global reach scenario, this scenario where we imagine returning to the vision of maybe a decade or 2 decades ago, when most international barriers to trade would be dismantled. But also good are the smaller cooperation scenarios that Mike mentioned, improvements in the CPTPP, or just implementing the RCEP. The CPTPP means adding first England and South Korea and some other countries to that agreement who have already applied. Okay, so what are the trade takeaways from cooperation? Significant benefits, about 1.5 trillion for the world. ASEAN, even this small group of countries, a small, very open group of countries, is very positively affected. And then you have the benchmark scenario, this kind of vision of the future, which is good even for the very large, not so open economies like the United States, like China, and Europe. The labor market effects are generally positive, more employment, higher real wages. And the bottom line is that this scenario roughly offsets the deglobalization effects that we looked at earlier. So I'll just stop there. I think the story is good, bad, and the ugly. We do, I mean, I think of ugly as the world as it's now evolving, the kind of new normal, which is not looking good, although it hasn't yet exploded in ways it could still. And then the really bad scenario is the deglobalization follow-up to the current deterioration in global economic conditions. And there is a solution, and that solution is returning to something like the vision of trade among countries that persisted up till about a decade or so ago. Thank you very much. Sorry if I went over, not by too much. But
Thanks, Peter, for the presentation of that brilliant piece of work. Richard?
Okay, thanks. Okay, thanks, Mike, and thanks for inviting me. It's good to be back in Bologna. I will be back in January, as Mike said, so I might meet you a bit more there. I'd also mention that the paper I'm going to present is one I'm presenting in January at the American Economic Association meeting. So if anyone has comments, I would really welcome them, particularly if you spot things that are just plain wrong. What I'm going to be doing, how it fits together with the previous paper, is that the previous paper was making projections of the indirect and direct effects of things like particularly the war in Ukraine. Right? And that's a really important thing to do. What I want to do is just focus on one specific effect, go down to the micro level and look at a specific global supply chain that has been disrupted by the war, why it matters, and how the participants have reacted to this. So, working. Yeah, I don't see the screen. Yeah, that's okay. So the motivation for this is when we look at international supply chains, they're clearly dependent on ease of crossing borders, they're dependent on ease of transport, and they want efficient connectivity in terms of not just price, but also speed and reliability, because supply chains are really based on just-in-time delivery, maintaining inventories at the lowest possible level. And one of this, to give some background to this, one of the features we've seen in the global economy is over the last 20 years, people have talked a lot more about global value chains or supply chains, something that we really identified becoming important since probably the 1980s. But actually, when we look at these global value chains, they're primarily regional value chains. They've been centered on North America, East Asia, and Europe. And they've only really been linked to the very final stage of when the goods have been produced and have been shipped, mostly by sea, to the ultimate markets. And what I'm going to look at is the rail connections between the East Asian value chain and Western Europe, or Europe in general, which I refer to as the Eurasian Rail Land Bridge, because this was the first major overland link between international supply chains. It's one that grew very, very rapidly in the last decade, from 2011 to 2021. So I want to look a little bit at how that happened, and particularly just how important efficient supply chain management has been for firms that are producing along international value chains. And this is all about trade-offs, basically. The rail is faster, more reliable than sea transport, but more expensive. How do you trade that off? How it starts the rail connections between Europe and China is that European car makers, particularly Volkswagen, Audi, BMW, Mercedes, wanted to send components to their factories, their assembly plants in China. There's a big boom in Chinese demand for cars in the first decade of this century, and the German car makers were established as more quality, better quality, and then for that they needed the components coming in from Europe. And at the same time, electronics companies that had moved to central China, to Chengdu and Chongqing, wanted a way to get their goods back to Europe. And both of these are examples where the things being moved were sufficiently valuable to be worth paying a premium for rapid delivery. And this was very clearly market driven, but at the same time, the participants were looking for ways of trying to get away, of trying to diversify from the main line that ran through Kazakhstan, Russia, Belarus, because there's always this, when you've got a link like that, there's always a chance that one of the links on the chain might try to take advantage, put up the transit rates to take advantage of your dependence. So they've been looking for alternatives. So something was happening. This search for alternatives obviously going to be driven much more after the breakout of the war in Ukraine. So what I'm going to do in terms of my presentation, I'll talk very briefly about the expansion of this land bridge. I'll look at how resilient it was, even when we had things like the 2014 annexation of Crimea and the deterioration of relations at the political level, or we have COVID, that really benefited the rail link, because rail's not affected by COVID anywhere near as much as maritime shipping was. And then, thirdly, then look at what happened in 2022, when clearly there is a much more disastrous exogenous shock, because Russian railways were put on the sanctions list by the EU and the United States. So this just became a non-usable route for most of the participants. So just to say very briefly about the establishment of this, it was set up, the first regular train service was established in 2011. Very, very quickly, we see the establishment of services that become weekly, and it becomes a virtuous circle, because the more frequent and reliable the services are, the more users that they were attracting. And so we see companies being very much participating. The German rail company, Deutsche Bahn, it becomes their main profit center, becomes these services between Germany and China. Firms like DHL, FedEx, UPS, also very much involved in there, as well as other freight forwarders. And we see this growth very rapidly. The route between Chongqing and Duisburg, probably the most used route, became daily in 2016. The time that was taken for that was cut to about 15 days compared to about 40 days by sea, and much more reliable than sea. And so if we look at the route maps by 2017, we see about 30 cities in China are linked to about a similar number in Europe. The freight forwarders are looking for the best route. Do you want to go to Duisburg? There's a lot of businesses within 100 kilometers of Duisburg, well connected. But if you want to go to Madrid, then you want a train that goes direct to Madrid, not to going through Duisburg. So we see this happening, and why I emphasize 2017 is 2017 was when the Belt and Road Initiative was launched. So this is often associated with the Belt and Road Initiative, but just making the point that the rail services were well established before President Xi launched the BRI. If we look at how much traffic is going on this route, you see most of it is going through the red and the blue bars here are the routes that go through Kazakhstan. So this is the fastest route. So it's whatever we've got there, about 12,000 trains using that route, compared to something that is still using the old Trans-Siberian Railway. The yellow is the route that goes through Mongolia, and the blue and the orange are the routes going through directly through Russia across the border in northeast China. And if we look at the data we have, the data is imperfect because we're not really know how much of this use the different routes and how much is just going to Russia. But probably the best data is from the UTC, which is the alliance of the railways of railroads. Excuse the Australian. The railways of Kazakhstan, Russia, and Belarus. And we see this really rapid growth from basically from 0 to 46,000 containers in 2015, 300,000 in 2019, and then this big increase during the COVID outbreak as people are shifting from maritime to rail connections. This is consistent also with the Chinese data on the number of trains. There's a different unit, the number of trains going to and from China along the rail bridge, which goes very, very rapidly from close to 0, 17 trains. That's one every 3 days in 2011 when the service is first established, to 15,000 by 2021, which is, what is that? I don't know, a lot of trains per day. We also see that China's been very active in trying to promote alternative routes. But if you think about the map, it's very difficult. Anything that doesn't go through Russia has got to go across the Caspian Sea, which is a route that was promoted by the EU back in the 1990s without many takers, or you've got to go through Iran, which has led to sanctions problems because of US secondary sanctions. But in 2016, when the UN sanctions were eased, on January 1st, I think it was January 15th, President Xi was in Tehran, and at the end of January, the first train running between China and Iran happened. Yeah, problematic to go any further because the line's not very good between Iran and Turkey. Yes, so I didn't get that. The alternative to the Iranian route is the so-called middle corridor. This is the one I mentioned going across the Caspian Sea. That's also been tried. It avoids Russia, which was an attractive diversification feature, but it does reach problems because when you've crossed to the Caspian Sea, you either take the rail system down through Istanbul and then go on to Europe, or you go across the Black Sea to Bulgaria or Romania, both of which mean that the journey time was much longer. So this is kind of the situation we have in 2019, 2020, 2021. We've got much traffic going along the main line. Air freight essentially stopped during COVID. Transport by road was disrupted because requirements for drivers to be tested. Sea freight was disrupted by quarantine and other restrictions, so ships were in the wrong place. The journey times for cargo from East Asia ports to European ports increased from about 50 days to 100 days during 2021. There are also kind of clear evidence of the unreliability of maritime delivery when a major container ship got stuck in the Suez Canal in the middle of the year. And you think of these container ships, they're really big. They've got 20,000 containers on them. The trains have got about 40 on them. So this, you can see why maritime trade is much cheaper, but also, yeah, it's not reliable. You don't know when the arrival time would be. So many shippers turned to the rail option, which flourished in 2020-21. We look at maritime shipping times. You know, they really soared during that year. So we see that these are looking from the Far East going westbound or Trans-Pacific going eastbound. Not exactly what I'm talking about, but it's very clear that shipping rates go up. This is shipping times go up and shipping rates go up. So then we get to the external shock. We get the Russia-Ukraine war. Financial and export sanctions are imposed by the United States and the EU, and which meant European companies could face issues with money transactions. And then a few days later, Russian railways themselves are added to the sanctions list. There's also the problems if you can't get insurance anymore because of active war clauses. So what we see is clearly a huge decline in transport along the land bridge. Very hard to find data on this. The official website tries to mask it a bit, says there were still 400,000 containers going over the first 8 months. It seems most of those were going between China and Russia, not actually going on to Europe. But we're not completely sure about the data here. So what happens? Yeah, well, people look for alternatives and they build on the alternatives. Within days, in February, the end of February 22, a train sets out from China and it's going to go to Istanbul. That's the green line here. It goes across the Caspian Sea, hooks up with the rail system from Azerbaijan through Georgia to Turkey, gets to Istanbul, goes on a boat to Trieste, and then it's in the European rail system. Yeah, obviously seems a bit clumsy, but still better than shipping because it's taking some 20 days maybe rather than the still 60, 70 days by sea. So my point about this is just how innovative the freight forwarders are who are putting together these trains, and the service responded to the demands of the customers who really valued these links between China and Europe. It's the same customers are in there, but also it's clearly much more cumbersome. The change of mode to cross the Caspian Sea is obviously a problem. An alternative would be this white dotted line on this map would be from Georgia to go across to Constanta in Romania, so you're already in the EU. But that's not great because Constanta's completely congested because a lot of stuff from Odessa has been diverted there. So lots of issues, but still, I think the story of this is that is the immediacy with which the alternatives were turned to. What do we think might happen in the longer term? Well, what we see as one of the effects is already by the end of March, the governments and the train services of Georgia, Azerbaijan, Turkey, and Kazakhstan are making agreements to simplify the route. What you need is the agreement so that you cross borders pretty much seamlessly. Where you have a change of gauge from the old Russian Empire system to the standard gauge, you want the facilities to shift the containers from a Kazakh train from a Georgian train to a Turkish train. So we see this going very quickly. We also see the EU always moves a bit more slowly, but we see the EU has its transport policy, the 10T policy, that it starts to negotiate how that can be fitted in with using this middle corridor. I said that there had been a major EU policy that failed in the 1990s. This time seems to have come. We also see at the recent meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, we see meetings of the leaders of Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan and China to, whoops, wrong one, go back, to have a new railway line that would connect Kashgar, the most westerly point on the Chinese rail system, with Uzbekistan through Kazakhstan. It's been talked about for about a decade. Yes, it's quite expensive, goes through a part of Kyrgyzstan where nobody lives, so Kyrgyzstan's not so keen on it. But finally, the three countries agree on who will finance it, mainly China and Uzbekistan. And clearly what that does provides another route, going east-west route, that is going to go from China through Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and bypasses Kazakhstan, as well as Russia. So, and it's a faster route to Tehran or to the Caspian. So, what we're seeing is a recognition that if you want to have these connections for supply chains, you not only want efficiency and price and speed, but you also want some reliability and some defense against exogenous shocks. Running out of time, let me move on to my conclusions. And main conclusions I want to emphasize here are that we have, from an economist perspective, I think it was really interesting how the evolution of this land bridge highlighted the importance of connectivity for international supply chains and how much of it was private sector driven. You needed collaboration of the rail companies, which are all national owned. You need collaboration of customs services. Very little infrastructure was needed, but some infrastructure, but mostly it's driven by the private sector. We see that it, from even in the 2010s, there was recognition of the dangers of relying on a system with a single choke point, in Russia. Very difficult to find alternatives, so that moved quite slowly, but it's been given a stimulus by the cutting off of the transit through Russia. If we look at the long term, is it still important? I think yes, it is important, because electric trains along well-maintained tracks are clearly more environmentally friendly than ships or planes or trucks. We also, I think, see some evidence of pent-up demand. During this year, there's been a very large increase in transporting electric vehicles from China to Europe. I think it went up, what's the number I've got now, 80% or something, in the first 9 months of this year. They're not allowed to be transported by rail at the moment. Chinese law says you can't transport electric vehicles by rail because of the dangers associated with batteries, so they've got to go on a boat. There's strong lobbying to remove that restriction, which would be another major stimulus to demand for using the rail route. So I see this as something that's got long-term, very strong economic reasons for it. Short-term, quite flexible in responding to major exogenous shocks. If anybody does have questions, I would really appreciate them. There's some background, your blogs here I refer to that talk about obviously the rise of the land bridge, but don't talk about the war and its reactions. But I would be very much pleased to receive any reactions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Richard. I think interesting coupling the papers with Richard's looking very much at these micro risks and Peter more at the macro risk, et cetera. So this leaves us Manuela.
Thank you very much. I was very pleased of being requested to comment on these two very, very interesting papers. And, you know, both papers have a common theme, which is, of course, the geopolitical risk, the macroeconomic risk, the global risk for markets that are basically implied by exogenous shocks. So shocks that were not expected when the system was projected and when the institutions were set up. And both papers basically speak about the resilience. This is a popular word nowadays, the resilience of markets to these shocks. What's the first thing that we see when oh, thank you. What we know basically is that all the trade restructuring policies, all the restructuring of value chains, reshoring offshore productions, all the policies that are now discussed in various countries by what we could call sovereignist governments and so on and so forth, don't work. So they would make countries poorer, they would make things worse for not only for the countries that have to, you know, bear the consequences of these policies. So the countries that will be abandoned by you know, FDIs, but also for the countries themselves that that very often want to and propose to you know, get these policies. So all the policies that somehow abdicate to the principles of free trade and that are often advocated in these days should be treated with extreme care and maybe be very short-term policies. But how can you possibly think about, you know, reshoring or friendshoring as a short-term policy? Clearly, these are policies that have consequences for the long term. And, you know, these studies demonstrate they should not be pursued. The policies instead that are devoted to more cooperation, to the enlargement of the free trade areas, are instead very good policies. What I found particularly interesting in both studies are, for instance, in the paper by Mike and by Peter, is the extensions that they make to the big model that they use, the extensions looking at the effects on wages, on the employment, the extensions looking at the effects on the GVCs. There was not enough time today to present those extensions because it's the developing of those parts in the model that actually will give the precious indications for the policymakers. In fact, we know that the greatest resistance to free trade comes not from the overall effects of free trade. We know, and now it's established, all theories demonstrate that free trade basically increases what we call the size of the pie, increases the overall income that has to be shared among the countries. So free trade is a good thing. But what happens is often that free trade produces a redistribution of income, produces inequalities. And so knowing exactly which will be the workers that will be, for instance, affected by these new shocks that we are experiencing in the markets will be most important to give indications to the policymakers to deal with these shocks and also to develop possibly policy instruments that would you know, enter into action almost automatically when these shocks that now we know that can happen might happen again. In a sense, while you know listening to these papers, some questions came to my mind. The first one is that, well, when reading the paper, Mike and Peter say something very interesting. It's like they were writing a paper. They were writing this paper, this important paper on restructuring and geopolitical risk. And then all of a sudden, in the middle of writing it, the world changed. So was the commodity prices started to rise, and then, of course, something that was hard to anticipate. Russia invaded Ukraine. So basically, when we do policy predictions, often we work with models that are somehow unable or not prepared to consider, these shocks. And then, of course, anticipating the war is very difficult. But the rise in prices, could we see the rise in commodity prices come from anywhere? It all hit us as a surprise. But in a sense, if we look at what were the policies that were proposed after the COVID pandemic, which is another very big event, another very big shock that hit the markets, well, the United States and Europe with the Next Generation EU, they both proposed big programs of public spending to, push back the economies to the level pre-pandemics. And of course, that was possibly the ignition point of these price raises, the expectations that there would be a sharp increase in demand for commodities to, produce the infrastructures that were financed with the public spending plans that were proposed, immediately pushed the financial markets, the commodity markets, to speculate in the futures for commodities and for raw materials in the anticipation of this increase in demand. And so the first question that I have, not being an expert in these models, is how these very complex models treat the financial market, in a sense, which seems to be one of the major players nowadays in this kind of events, in this kind of developments. So there is another potential effect, which is was mentioned by Mike at the beginning, the monetary tightening that now we are experiencing. I read yesterday, it was just by chance that I read this figure that basically said that they increased the interest rates that has been occurring in the US could produce an increase in interest payments of $1 trillion in 10 years. And that by 2029, the expenditure in debt service will overcome the national defense expenditure. That was the New York Times yesterday, which, they seem rather huge figures. So, monetary tightening might not have a short-term effect, might not have a short-term impact on terms of trade, maybe, but are we sure that the increase in the cost of debts might not be substantial and actually determine a really serious impact in the near future, the next 10 years and so on and so forth. So these are two questions. Then a third question that comes from, the very interesting account that, Richard gave about the Landsbridge route is like, okay, when we consider the impact of these policies, we consider the impact on GDP, the impact on growth. Do we consider the environmental cost? For instance, the environmental cost of GVC. The final, comment that you made in the conclusions, there was they are thinking, China, Europe, the US, they are thinking about developing electric trains to transport, the goods, because those they have a lower impact on the environment. So we think about, okay, that GVCs should of course be established in the countries with the, with a comparative advantage, as we studied. But comparative advantage possibly nowadays should also take into account environmental costs and not only GDP. Because the estimate of GDP that we make without taking into account environmental costs might be, not complete in a sense, might lack an important side. And so finally, I'd like to conclude with, an idea that you know I'm thinking about and I'm working on an ongoing research project is somehow connected to this. It's like, okay, here we talked about a global risk for the market today, but there could be also a global risk from the market. So the idea is that all the policy projections that we make, all the simulations that we make often use a constant market structure. And they're often based on the idea that by opening to trade, by opening the market, and also by using the institutions that they exist, for instance, in the WTO, we will move closer to a more competitive market, to a perfectly competitive market, in a sense. However, there is a question that is still unanswered about the potential links between globalization, so enlarging the world market, and market concentration. Doing a survey of the literature on this, what we see is that in recent years, we see many indicators that suggest an increase in market power overall. For instance, an increase in markup, an increase, so in the average markup, an increase of the Erfindel index in many sectors. Now, the reason for such increases is still unclear. Why is the market becoming more concentrated? And of course, this is not true in all parts of the world. For instance, in the EU, this is not happening. In the US, we see different signs. In other parts of the world, we see different signals. Well, it's still unclear why the market concentration is increasing. And I mean, one idea could be that it is globalization that is bringing about market concentration. And that would be possibly intuitive if you think that you work in a bigger market. In order to be competitive on a bigger market, you need to be bigger. But if some parts of the world are not allowed, do not allow their companies to become big because they have the myth of the small and medium enterprises, of course, there will be some firms, possibly the European firms, that are not going big, and other firms from other countries that instead allow the firms to become big, that will become bigger. And so the market will becomes more concentrated. That might be an idea, might be a suggestion, but the data do not support this suggestion. The scanty empirical evidence says that this is a story that is not limited to the digital giants, for instance, and to the digital platform businesses. And also it seems that, it's an increase in concentration that does not affect in particular, so does not affect especially the markets that are more exposed to globalization. So the idea that globalization might be linked somehow to market concentration at the moment does not find support. We might have an anecdotal, evidence, but not statistical evidence so far. It seems, for instance, that financial markets worldwide are driving concentration. So financial markets are becoming more and more concentrated. The healthcare sector is becoming more and more concentrated, driven by the US. But not specific sectors, involved in globalization. Still, to cut a long story short, do we know what is the impact of free trade on market concentration? So rather than talking about globalization with the possible definition, what does free market do on market concentration? Because thinking about an endogenous market structure that changes when we increase cooperation, of course, might be an important variable to include. And from a policy point of view, would bring about the idea of an international antitrust authority that somehow supervises the world market, together with the fiscal authority that makes sure that there is that companies pay taxes, and that there is adequate redistribution of the value added that they produce. So global risk for the market, which was the focus point of today's very, very interesting presentations. And it's crucial given that we are all suffering from the consequences of these risks that, fell on our economies, but also maybe a global risk from the market that would require development, an evolution of the institutions, starting from the WTO and other institutions connected. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for those comments, Manuela. Let me take the fourth one, which is on your research, which is really fascinating. I guess my recommendation would be a bit to sort of redefine what globalization is. When I look at the data, globalization increased until the global financial crisis, and since then has sort of peaked, and in some ways is going the opposite direction. So, I mean, these days, I think we're talking more about closing rather than free trade. So, but maybe that allows you to split the time frame, right? So pre-crisis and post-crisis. But anyway, the other three questions, I'd leave the first two for Peter, and the third one, of course, for Richard.
Very briefly, I think the first two questions were connected, so I think they're quite interesting, and frankly, they represent a weakness of the model in the sense that some of these, some of the projections of things we don't expect, the model doesn't do any better, frankly, than the rest of us who don't expect it. So, I mean, it's a weakness of the model in the sense that it doesn't have it, although my concern is that there are a lot of risks in the environment that we are generally very bad at anticipating or measuring. So one example I think Dr. Carbonara has made very clear, which is we did not expect, although we should have for several reasons, natural resource prices to begin rising again. If only because they had been falling for so long, and the idea that relative prices are going to continue their past momentum is not terribly well supported by data in many areas. But also, I think, because of the other aspect that you mentioned, that the inflationary pressure is built into the economy as a result of the pandemic, because of the payments that governments made everywhere as a result of the pandemic. You should have been expected to give them that boost. But the truth is, nobody expected them to happen until they happened. So our kind of big discovery was that in between, and we tried, by the way, and this is one result of this, we tried to calibrate the model very closely to the projections people in respectable agencies, the IMF, the World Bank, the OECD, were making about the crucial parameters. And natural resource prices were one of them. And nobody expected them to happen until they did happen in late 2021. I don't know whether the model today is subject to many of those things. My guess it is. And this potential of a very severe recession and setback for the world economy is also something, and I should mention that, and it's also something I think Mike and I worry about, but nobody else, at least in their formal projections, has that built in so far. So we are subject to risks that, unfortunately, very difficult to predict until it's on us.
Yeah. A very quick note about the environment. Clearly that's becoming increasingly important. In a specific case I'm looking at, I think that's been an issue with the EU becoming involved in negotiating with China about the management. The EU has carbon border adjustment measures. That clearly is a thing that will work to the advantage of rail, because rail clearly has advantages over road or sea in that respect. Just one other point I'd mention very quickly. I mean, the EU is collaborating with China. When we look at CPTPP, The UK is currently negotiating. The CPTP has made it very clear you don't really negotiate. You take the package and you say what you'll give up to join. Next in line is China. And I suspect that China is much more involved in the plans of the EU or the CPTP countries than the United States. Because in your model, you kind of leave China alone. I mean, I think it's a real probability that we'll be in CPTPP at the end of next year.
I was on a panel once with name escapes me right now, who, when I mentioned that, told me there was a 0 probability that that would happen. So I agree with you. Okay, we have a little bit of time. We can take at least a question or two from the floor, if there are any. Also online, we've had about 12 people following us online. If anybody has a question. Or if people think of them, I just might mention, oh yeah, there we go, Alessandro.
Yes, I have I'm Alessandro Merli, I'm an associate fellow here. I have a clarification to ask on the first paper and maybe a broader question. The clarification is about your graph, if I understood it correctly, on the impact of the resource shock. And you show a negative effect on Russia, unlike, for instance, the other energy producers or raw materials producers. And I was wondering why that is, as you know, of course, Russia benefits from the boom in the prices of the raw material it exports, unless you assume that, you know, sanctions will be watertight, and instead of destruction of exports from Russia, there will be, there will be just deviation, destruction, not deviation to other markets that are not, for instance, the EU or the US. So that just to clarify that, because then you say that the other producers will benefit and Russia will not. I mean, it shows a decrease. And a more general question is about the benefits from the various regional groupings and their progress. And I was wondering if that is independent of the well-functioning WTO, which doesn't seem to be at the moment particularly well-functioning. And, you know, these countries will reap the benefits from the various region progress in various regional initiatives, even if, you know, the WTO doesn't seem to be, the overall umbrella of the WTO doesn't seem to be functioning particularly well.
Peter?
I think the first question having to do with Russia, I don't have in front of me the exact degree to which Russia loses from the increased resource prices. But what is happening there in the model is that there are lots of restrictions connected with sanctions, which also impede Russia's ability to conduct the trade in oil and in natural resources. So there are costs imposed on Russia as a result of the sanction, even in the industries in which prices are going up. So, and the other interesting piece of the simulations of these high resource price scenario is that actually the volume of trade declines in those products because demand due to the high prices decline. So my guess is that, and I haven't looked at it closely, is that it's some interaction of those factors of other penalties on Russian trade and of the declining overall demand for those products that by the way, we have seen another example of this issue, that we have high resource prices combined with reductions in demand in just the recent announcement in which both Russia and Saudi Arabia will be cutting their supplies and their sales in order to keep prices high.
On the second question, by the way, some of these regional cooperation organizations are sort of outward looking, right? So you don't see a great deal of trade diversion. What is more interesting, I think, is the opposite of trade diversion, because these countries have so many agreements with each other that when it opens up more, sometimes they can be negatively affected. Australia is a really interesting point. So Australia gains through the first two enlargements of the CPTPP, but then with that big mega enlargement, it doesn't change much at all beyond that. And the reason being, it got these sort of preferential markets that it used to enjoy. And now when it opens up to China, when China gets open access to these markets, the US does, it ends up having a balancing effect that actually hurts the rich growth. Anyway, Richard. Oh, sorry. We've got a question on the environmental costs in the GVC.
Yeah, I talked about that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. All right. Okay, well, Antonio.
My name is Antonia Maioni. I'm a visiting fellow here, and I'm not an economist. I don't know if that's a confession or not, but I'll put it out there. Professor Petri, I was wondering if you could tell me if your model or how your model takes into account any internal trade barriers. So I'm thinking, for example, in the Indo-Pacific region, in a country like India, are there specific things about internal economic barriers that have any impact, can be measured in your model, or have any impact in that way?
I think the answer to the last part of the question is, can those things be measured, and could you measure their impact? I think the answer to that is yes. If you knew, for example, that the trade within India of a certain product restricted the use of that product in some downstream industries, for example, then when you remove that barrier, downstream industries would enjoy lower costs and prosper from that. So you could measure the effects of that from changing barriers to effects on consumption and ultimately the economy. As for to what extent we take them into account, we do take them into account, but very implicitly, in the sense that we have a trade structure within the economy of each of these countries, an input-output table that represents the state of things now. And we assume that state doesn't change. In other words, we assume India will not lower internal barriers. So we have it there, but don't really do the things with it that I think you'd be interested in seeing the effects of. And I would hope that there are some CGE calculations in India for the effect of reductions in barriers to internal trade that might answer them, but I'm not familiar with it.
We're up against time, so I think all that's left is to thank our panelists for a very interesting discussion. So thanks, Emanuela, Peter, Richard. Okay.
Yeah.
Insurance company, so I was on the road, but I apologize.
Yeah,
It's really rude when you're chairing a session. It's kind of an emergency.
Are you coming to lunch?
Of course.
Yeah. You already answered the question.
Huh?
You already answered her question. Your daughter's question.
What?
You already answered your daughter's question.
Oh, yeah. Well, it was about the address